Hi pals, it's Mick. This week I'm going to welcome you back to regular scheduling with a watercolour piece of one of my favourite games characters, Alice Little. So I got this masking fluid and it came on the actual day that I was going to film this. I was going to try and do the painting without it, but it came, so I decided to use it and this Araldo di Paolo size 14 flat brush, as well as this tool, which is actually a clay sculpting tool, but I thought that it could be used as something to peel up the masking fluid. So I wanted to do the background of this piece first. I had a really good idea of what I wanted to do, and it isn't a detailed background, it's not something crazy, it's just a background that I took inspiration from the game Alice Madness Returns to do, and I had a mock-up of it on my iPad, so I had a good idea of what I wanted to do, and I thought that it would be easier to do it first. I mixed up these two colours and went in. Using the masking tape made it really easy because obviously I didn't have to worry, and it made it so that the paint was able to stay wet for longer, and that made the blending of the gradient that I wanted to do much easier. And even though that was the case, I did go over it a couple of times with different kinds of washes and using the same colours just so that I could get the gradient just right. Overall, I was really happy with how it turned out. I was surprised because I was worried. I don't think it came out necessarily true to the game, but I do think that it came out how I wanted it to come out, I guess. Kind of as if it was just what the game did, but in my style. I just added a little bit more darkness to the red because I thought it was a little bit too vibrant, and then I'm going in with this clay tool to try and peel up the masking fluid that I put down earlier. I had a bit more trouble than I had thought. I got this masking fluid in particular because of Kasey Golden's video comparing masking fluid, and this was one of the ones that she recommended. I did find it relatively easy to work with, and all the reasons that I had trouble were my own fault. As you can see here, I'm having a little bit of trouble with this particular bit, and it was because I overworked the masking fluid. And basically what I mean by that was I tried to go over it again after it had already started to dry. It dries really quickly, and I had this theory that using more of it, so making it thicker, would make it work better, which is true, but it needs to go down before it starts to dry. I also found out that using that particular tool was not as good as just using my hands. As you might be able to see, it did leave a little bit of residue behind, but nothing too drastic that paint wasn't going to cover. And also, if you're using your fingers like I was, you do run the risk of smudging your sketch a little bit, especially if you're using graphite rather than a coal erase pencil like I have here. Once I was finished peeling up the masking fluid, I just rolled over the sketch to lighten it with my kneadable eraser, and I just want to show you the stuff that comes up. It's kind of gross looking. It's really plasticky. It's just kind of like rolled up plastic. I don't know how else to describe it. But anyway, once I was done with that, I started to go in with painting the character. Now, I made a mistake almost immediately. This belt or buckle or whatever it is isn't actually supposed to connect from the neckline to the corset, but it did in my painting. The ring that you might see me paint in later is actually what's supposed to connect them, but yeah. I did want to take a little bit of time to talk about the character that I'm painting here because I don't know if everybody knows about the game that she's from, and I think that it is a really underrated and undervalued game. I'm not sure that I've heard of many other people playing it. However, recently Smolders played it. She's a streamer, she is really good, and she uploads her stream onto YouTube, so I will link her YouTube videos in the description down below, and I'm probably going to pop them in a card at the top right hand side of the screen. She played this game recently and it reminded me how much I loved it. This is one of the only games in my entire life that I have played all the way through. Originally it was an Xbox game. I also bought it on Steam a few years ago so that I could play it on PC. And I didn't finish it again at the time, but I decided once Gab had played it, I wanted to play it again because it really holds up. This game is from 2011, which was my final year of high school, and it was something that kind of became a nostalgic thing for me. So I thought that playing it almost 10 years later was, I don't know, it seems cool, and the fact that it's still a good game, the graphics aren't too distracting, and in fact the art style is really cool, I thought it would be really fun to play again, and I have not been disappointed so far. I haven't finished it yet, but I'm well on my way, and I love it. Did I actually mention the name of the game? The name of the game is Alice Madness Returns. I guess it's kind of a story MMO RPG sort of thing. You don't get to choose what your character looks like, obviously, because Alice herself is an established character in the canon of Alice in Wonderland, but her dress does change over the course of the game, and this one I think is probably my favourite. I'm not sure because they're all really, really cool, but also I was worried when I went into this painting about contrast, because this outfit itself is, you know, the colours already pre-picked, and I wasn't sure looking at it that there would be contrast when I drew it in my own style, when I painted it with my own watercolour techniques. Overall, I think eventually I managed to get contrast out of it, but I think that it definitely could be improved upon. Here I'm adding texture to the apron on the front of her dress by just kind of stabbing my brush into the page, and that's the same technique that I learned from Kasey Golden and the same technique that I use for blood. This is one of my favourite parts of the painting. I wasn't going to include it initially, but I saw a reference photo, or I guess a reference of the original art, and it included it, and I just thought it looked really, really cool, and I love the pattern on it, and it was something that I wasn't sure if I could achieve, but I wanted to challenge myself, and I don't hate how it turned out. I don't think it's amazing. I think it's one of those things that looks better from far away. The game Alice Madness Returns is really nostalgic for me, but not only that, it's just a great psychological concept. It's really, really fun to think about, and if you like psychology, if you're interested in horror, it's probably for you. Here I'm just showing you again that I was using the masking fluid, and this time I'm using it over watercolour paint rather than using it before adding watercolour paint. I added it over to see what it acted like, to see how much it affected the paint that it goes over, and I waited for it to dry for a while, so you'll see me adding in other elements like the stripes on her tights and the little bolts on her apron. I believe that the apron is meant to be made out of hard leather because the whole look is a bit steampunky. anyway, here we go, painting over the masking fluid that I had put down, and I leave that to dry obviously before I peel up the masking fluid beneath it. So in order to spend some time outside of that, I drew in all of the buckles on her arms. I think that this was just a stylistic choice. It does look really cool, but I don't think that they serve any kind of function apart from making the look appear more steampunk in aesthetic. So as you can see, I peeled up the masking fluid from over the paint, and it looks like it didn't have a huge effect, which is great, but I also didn't mind if that colour came up a little bit lighter, so I was happy with how it turned out, but I do think that it did have an effect, it just didn't bother me too much. Then I'm adding some shadows to the underneath of her skirt and to the sides of her stockings to make them look more 3D. As well as some lines because I didn't think that they were quite defined enough. Then I started adding stitches to the buckles on her boots. Again, I don't think that they're necessarily anything more than an aesthetic choice. I don't think they serve a particular function, but I did want to add in all of these little details because with my last painting, with the first video of a prompt series, I realized how much I really enjoy small details, but also how much I enjoy simplifying small details. So with these stitches, as well as with the vorpal blade, you might, if you were to look at the reference photo, notice how I've simplified relatively intricate patterns, as well as kind of simplified her outfit a little bit. I think that I've included all of the elements, but things like the buckles, making them really simple, and the fixtures in her outfit, I think that they are definitely a lot more simplified than the original art. And I don't know if that's a stylistic choice or if that's simply my ability level, but yeah. For her skin tone, I was going for a really light complexion, and at this stage I've had a relatively good amount of practice with skin tones, so I think that I got it pretty good. And I was also quite happy with the shading as well as the addition of the red around her eyes and nose, and I have learned from previous paintings that the watercolour is quite a transparent medium, and that seems obvious, I guess, but basically what I mean to say is that I knew that I could put down a really saturated red and then sort of wash it away with the wash and pull technique that I've talked about before in previous videos, and it would come out in a way that I liked, which it did. I think I went a little bit overboard with the masking fluid because I was really excited to have it, but it also proved really helpful. So for the blood on the knife, I put down the masking fluid obviously, and then where I wanted the blood, I put down a tiny little bit of water, and then I soaked it up mostly with my brush. The reason that I did this was because I needed it to be damp, but not so wet that it would bloom all over the place and get messy. Once I'd done that, I laid down 3 different washes of red so that I could build up to the intensity that I wanted. I wanted to start muted and desaturated so that I knew where I wanted to go with it rather than jumping in with a bright red, because I wanted to avoid the mess of having to try and pull it up if I wanted to. And also red is a really vibrant pigment that I think is quite hard to pick up and is really good at staining, which you might notice because of the mistake that I made, where I kind of pulled the red a little bit too far and it goes over the back of the blade and into the white space that's separating Alice and her background. Once I spent some time doing some of the different elements so that the masking fluid could dry, I peeled it up and I began painting her hair. This went in a few layers as well, and I definitely used some of the techniques that I've learned over the past few videos. So I knew that her hair was going to be black. Obviously, she's a preset character. It wasn't a decision I made, it was something that I was following. So I knew her hair was going to be black, and I have painted black hair before and I've had trouble with black hair before. So what I did was I laid down a really light wash of black, which ended up looking grey obviously. And then while I let that dry, I worked on some of her facial features, and I love the colour of her eyes, but I do mess them up a bit later, so stay tuned for that, I guess. Then I go back to her hair, adding another layer, and here you'll see that I'm leaving some negative space for the shine that I want her hair to have. And that's something that was really important that I learnt from other videos, that I didn't want black hair to have a bright white shine. I didn't think that it looked realistic enough, not that I go for hyperrealism, but I didn't want it to be too stark. So the first layer is for that shine almost exclusively, and then the next layer is to exhibit that shine, I guess, is kind of a way to put it. Third layer, I start to add in the pigment. So this is where her hair starts to get its, I guess, true colour. It does dry a little bit lighter than it looks here, and I do go in with another layer, but this is where I start to really work on the colour and trying to make it look like her hair has strands. So I'm feeding into that shine of her hair so that you can see the strands of her hair. And I've also started to add the kind of baby hairs, I guess you would call them, that fall around her face. They're not exactly a fringe, but yeah. Now while the hair's drying, I go back and add some details to her dress. It has all of these cool stripes, and again, this is a kind of feature that I was simplifying because in the reference art it kind of looks like these are supposed to be depressions in the dress, not just stripes, but I think it adds to the texture and that's fine as it is. Here we are with another layer on the hair, and now you might notice that I'm sort of working on the shadows of the hair and making it so that it looks like there's a bit more dimension. So the front of her hair is being pulled back so you can see a deeper shadow behind, and then you can see that I am not filling in all of the space so that you can see the detailed strands of her hair. Additionally, I'm adding some flyaways so that it looks more realistic, and also Alice is meant to be kind of mentally unstable, and that is often translated in the game through her messy hair, and it was kind of a thing when the developers were creating the game initially that her hair was having issues because it was just flying all over the place. So I definitely thought that it was a feature that I needed to include because of that, and not only because I didn't want her hair to look super flat. Then I added the line art to her face, and overall I'm quite happy with it, but her left eye, well, her right, our left, I've obviously added a little bit too much paint to my brush, and there's kind of a chunky bit there that I try to fix here with my white Signo gel pen, but it's just not exactly what I wanted, and it's really upsetting for me because the face, as I've said previously, is my favourite and most, I think, the most important part of an illustration. However, it's not the worst thing that's ever happened. Then I make this a mixed media illustration by going in with my Art Spectrum white gouache paint, and I'm going around the edges of Alice to make it sort of look like she's glowing. I also added some clouds in the sky, and the way that I did this was using the same technique. I put down the opaque gouache and then I sort of faded out the edges with water. I did the same with the clouds, except that I used the stabbing motion that I used for the apron and also the blood, and that worked surprisingly well to look like clouds, I think, as well, along with some sort of stroking motion so that it looked like they were trailing through the sky. And then in order to make them look like clouds, I coloured underneath them to sort of add a shadow, and I used the same colour that I used for the background piece, but I mixed it with the white gouache because I wasn't sure if that would work or not, and I wanted to see if it would work, and I'm really happy with the result. Once I'd laid that down, I went over it with water in order to kind of disperse that colour, and then I finished it off with the platform that she's standing on, and I was inspired by some of the platforms that you have to use in the game. Then I'm putting on my signature with my white gel pen, and she's done. I forgot to include the peeling of the tape around the borders. I'm so sorry about that. I hope you enjoyed this process as much as I did. I had a lot of fun recreating a character that I love from a game that I love, and I really encourage you, if you have the time and the money, to go and download it on Steam and give it a go, because it's a really good game that really holds up. Even if you don't have nostalgia attached, the game is still worth. Thanks so much for watching this week's video. Please make sure you subscribe if you're interested, hit the like button if you enjoyed this week's video, and hit the dislike button if you didn't enjoy this week's video, because it's all engagement and I appreciate it nonetheless. Bye pals!